Your mind is still working. Right now, in this moment, even as you engage with these words, there is a part of your cognitive system that is not here. It is somewhere else, in the meeting that went badly yesterday, in the decision that needs to be made tomorrow, in the ongoing low-grade processing of everything that is unresolved in the landscape of your life. This is not a failure of concentration. It is the default operation of a brain that has been running in the elevated activation state of chronic stress long enough that the elevated state has become the new normal, and what the ancient traditions called the quiet mind has become, if not impossible, then genuinely difficult to access. The research on the prevalence of chronic stress in contemporary life is not reassuring. Multiple major surveys conducted across Western populations consistently find that the majority of adults report experiencing high stress levels on most days. That significant proportions report that stress is interfering with their ability to function well, sleep adequately, and maintain the quality of relationships they want. That the physical health consequences of sustained stress activation, cardiovascular, immunological, neurological, represent one of the most significant preventable contributors to premature illness and death in the population studied. And yet the dominant cultural response to this data is not the structural examination of the conditions producing the stress. It is the instruction to individual people to manage better, to practice self-care, to prioritize sleep, to find work-life balance. As if the problem is primarily the individual's relationship to conditions that are simply the conditions, rather than an honest reckoning with conditions that have been deliberately designed to produce exactly the sustained activation that the individual is being instructed to manage away on their own time. Part 1. What chronic stress is doing to your brain. Stress, in its acute form, is a life-saving biological response. The sudden elevation of cortisol and adrenaline, the acceleration of heart rate and respiration, the sharpening of sensory attention, and the narrowing of cognitive focus toward the immediate threat. These responses represent the nervous system at its most efficient, mobilizing the organism's full resources for the challenge that the moment presents. Acute stress, resolved by the response it produces and discharged when the threat has passed, is not harmful. It is, in the appropriate context, health-serving. Chronic stress, the sustained, unresolved activation of the stress response in circumstances where the threat is ongoing, where the response cannot resolve it, and where the return to baseline never fully occurs, is a different matter entirely. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, whose decades of research on the biology of stress has produced some of the most important and most accessible science in the field, has documented the specific and extensive damage that sustained stress activation does to the body and the brain. The hippocampus, the brain region most directly involved in memory formation and emotional regulation, shows measurable volume reduction in people under chronic stress. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, empathy, and the considered decision-making that most of our meaningful activities require, is progressively impaired. The amygdala, by contrast, becomes more reactive under chronic stress, more sensitive to threat signals, more likely to fire the alarm, lower in its threshold for the perception of danger. The chronically stressed person is, in the most literal neurological sense, more frightened of more things, not because the world has become more threatening, because the brain's threat detection system has been sensitized by sustained activation into a hair-trigger state that treats ordinary stressors as genuine emergencies. The immunological consequences are equally documented. Chronic cortisol elevation suppresses the immune system, not immediately and dramatically but gradually and systematically, in ways that increase susceptibility to infection, slow healing, and contribute to the inflammatory conditions that underlie many of the chronic diseases most prevalent in stressed populations. The gut, which contains one of the densest concentrations of immune tissue in the body, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of sustained stress activation, explaining the remarkable frequency with which chronic stress and gastrointestinal symptoms co-occur. Sleep is both a casualty and a remedy for chronic stress, and the relationship between them is cruelly circular. The elevated cortisol of chronic stress disrupts the architecture of sleep, reducing the proportion of restorative deep sleep and REM sleep, increasing the frequency of nighttime awakening, and producing the specific quality of sleep that feels, despite adequate duration, as if it has not provided genuine rest. The sleep-deprived brain, in turn, has a heightened threat response, is more reactive, more cortisol-prone, more likely to perceive and respond to stressors as emergencies. The chronically stressed person sleeps poorly. The poorly sleeping person is more stressed. The circle is tight and without deliberate intervention, self-maintaining. Understanding what chronic stress is doing to the brain and body changes the conversation from the moral to the physiological. The person who cannot concentrate, who snaps at people they love, whose physical health is deteriorating, who cannot access genuine pleasure or genuine rest. This person is not failing to make good choices. They are experiencing the documented, predictable consequences of a biology that has been running in emergency mode for longer than it was designed to sustain. The remedy begins with that understanding, and with the specific, evidence-based interventions that address the physiological state rather than only its behavioral expressions. Part 2. Why ordinary rest does not work. If you have tried to rest and found that the rest did not restore you, you are not failing at rest. You are experiencing one of the most consistently documented features of the chronically stressed state, the nervous system's inability to shift out of the activation mode, even in the apparent absence of the demands that produce the activation. The brain that has been running in high alert for an extended period does not simply switch to low alert when the external demands are briefly removed. It continues, largely automatically, the pattern that the sustained activation has established. The neuroscience behind this is specific. The amygdala's heightened reactivity means that the resting brain, left to its default mode network activity, tends to produce thought patterns that are oriented toward threat monitoring and problem-solving rather than the genuinely resting, diffused quality of thought that produces physiological restoration. The person who lies down to rest and finds their mind immediately and compulsively running through the problems of the day is not choosing to think about those problems. They are experiencing the automatic operation of a brain in which the threat monitoring system has become the dominant mode. The concept of psychological detachment from work, introduced by the researcher Sabine Sonnentag, describes the specific quality of mental disengagement from work-related thought during non-work time that is most strongly associated with genuine restoration, not merely physical absence from work. The complete, functional unavailability of the mind for work-related processing. Research consistently shows that the most important predictor of recovery from work stress is not the number of hours away from work, but the quality of psychological detachment during those hours. The person who spends the weekend physically present at home but mentally at work is not recovering. They are simply doing the work at a different location. The philosopher Joseph Pieper, whose work on leisure we encountered in an earlier discussion, described the specific quality of genuine leisure as the willingness to be receptive, to allow experience to come to you rather than producing experience through the effortful engagement that work requires. This receptivity is not passivity in the pejorative sense. It is the specific posture of the mind that is genuinely at rest, open, unhurried, present to what is rather than directed toward what needs to be produced. In the chronically activated brain, this posture is not naturally available. It must be cultivated, deliberately, against the grain of the established activation pattern. The research on what actually produces physiological restoration, as opposed to what feels like it should, is consistent across multiple streams of investigation. What works is not the passive consumption of entertainment. which frequently maintains or increases cognitive activation rather than reducing it. Not the reaching for the phone or the screen, which provides the nervous system with a continuous stream of the novel, potentially threatening information it is already hyperscanning for. What works is the genuine engagement of the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest state that is the physiological antidote to the fight or flight state of chronic stress activation. The parasympathetic nervous system is engaged by specific types of activity and experience that most people in states of chronic stress have significantly reduced access to. Genuine physical relaxation, slow and deliberate breathing, experiences of genuine safety and social connection, exposure to natural environments, rhythmic physical activity at moderate intensity, and the specific quality of present moment awareness that mindfulness and contemplative practices produce. None of these are magic. All of them are documented, and all of them require something that the activation state specifically resists: the willingness to slow down before the slowing down produces a result. Part 3. The Ancient Wisdom and the Modern Neuroscience. The contemplative traditions of human civilization, the meditation practices of Buddhism and Taoism, the contemplative prayer of the Christian mystical tradition, the Sufi practices of Islamic spirituality, the contemplative elements within Jewish learning and practice, were not developed with the language of neuroscience, but they were developed over thousands of years of careful observation of what happens to the human mind under sustained conditions of deliberate inner stillness. And what they observed, described in the language of their own traditions, corresponds with remarkable consistency to what modern neuroscience is now able to measure. The practice of meditation, in its most basic form, the deliberate, sustained direction of attention toward the present moment's experience, with the specific quality of non-judgmental awareness that allows whatever arises to be observed rather than immediately acted upon, produces documented neurological changes that directly counteract the effects of chronic stress. Regular meditation practice is associated with reduced amygdala reactivity, reduced cortisol levels, reduced inflammation markers, improved sleep quality, and increased thickness in the prefrontal cortex. It also shows measurable increases in the insula, the brain region most directly associated with the capacity to feel one's own bodily states accurately, which is both a marker of emotional intelligence and a resource for the genuine rest that requires genuine presence in the body. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, describes a quality of engagement with the world that is directly relevant to the rest conversation. Wu Wei is not passivity. It is the specific quality of acting in accordance with the natural flow of things rather than in constant, effortful opposition to them. The person in Wu Wei is not trying to force outcomes through the sustained effort of will. They are responsive, present to what is, appropriately engaged with what genuinely requires engagement, and genuinely at ease with what does not. This quality is, in physiological terms, the parasympathetic state, the state in which the nervous system is not in sustained mobilization, but in the genuine ease of appropriate alertness without unnecessary activation. The Jewish tradition of Shabbat, the weekly day of deliberate cessation from productive work, is one of the oldest institutionalized practices of genuine rest in the human record. Its theological significance notwithstanding, its psychological and physiological logic is straightforward and remarkably contemporary. The deliberate, scheduled, culturally supported practice of complete disengagement from the demands of productive life, from the identification of the self with its productive outputs, provides the nervous system with the specific, reliable, weekly experience of genuine deceleration that the body requires and that the constantly productive life systematically denies. The neuroscientist Andrew Huberman, whose work on the practical neuroscience of performance and recovery has reached wide popular audiences, describes what he calls non-sleep deep rest, NSDR, as one of the most powerful tools available for the restoration of cognitive performance and the regulation of the stress response. The practice involves a specific combination of deliberate physical stillness and directed but loose attention, not the focused attention of work or formal meditation, but the specific, loosely held awareness of the body's sensations that research shows is associated with the deepest forms of neural restoration. It is, in its physiological effects, what many contemplative traditions have been producing through their own methods for millennia. The convergence of ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience on the necessity and the specific conditions of genuine rest is one of the most compelling examples of different ways of knowing arriving at the same place. The traditions had it right. The science is now confirming why. And the knowledge, combined, provides both the philosophical foundation for taking rest seriously, as a moral and spiritual necessity rather than an optional self-indulgence, and the specific, practical tools for actually achieving it in the specific conditions of the contemporary life. Part 4. What stillness produces. The mind that has been given genuine rest produces things that the always-on mind cannot, not because rest produces them directly, through some mechanism of inspiration that the busy mind lacks, but because the specific neural processes that generate insight, creativity, genuine empathy, and the quality of considered judgment that the best decisions require are processes that cannot run simultaneously with the sustained activation of the stress response. They require a specific quality of neural environment, a lower activation level, a broader scope of neural processing, a relaxation of the executive functions that, when engaged, narrow the field of association and exclude the peripheral connections that often contain the most interesting material. The research on creative insight is instructive here. The moments of genuine insight, the solutions that arrive unbidden, the connections that appear from unexpected angles, the understanding that emerges fully formed after a period of apparently unproductive incubation, consistently occur not during focused, effortful work, but in the relaxed states of low cognitive demand. In the shower, on the walk, in the half-awake state between sleep and waking. In precisely the conditions that the chronically activated brain is systematically denied, and that the culture of constant productivity systematically devalues. The psychologist Adam Grant's research on the relationship between busyness and productivity reveals a counterintuitive finding that has significant implications for the always-on culture. Beyond a certain threshold, additional hours of focused cognitive work produce diminishing and then negative returns. The brain is not a machine that produces more output with more input indefinitely. It is a biological system with genuine recovery requirements, and the systematic denial of those requirements produces, predictably, the degradation of the very outputs it was supposed to enhance. The philosopher Simone Weil's concept of attention, the quality of receptive, unhurried, genuinely open presence to what is, cannot be produced by the chronically activated mind. Weil described it as the suspension of thought that allows the object of attention to be genuinely received rather than processed through the existing categories and agendas that the active mind brings to every encounter. This quality of attention, she argued, is the basis of genuine empathy, the capacity to actually receive another person's reality rather than processing it immediately through one's own frame. It is also, she noted, the quality most commonly sacrificed in the service of the busy, productive, always engaged life. The stillness that genuine rest produces is not the absence of thought. It is the specific quality of thought that is available when the survival imperatives have temporarily released their hold on the cognitive architecture. The thought that wanders rather than drives. The association that arises unexpectedly and stays long enough to be examined. The understanding that arrives from a different angle than the problem-solving mind would have approached it from. The empathy that is genuinely available to the other person's experience, because the self is not simultaneously processing its own threat response. These productions of stillness are not incidental. They are, in many domains, the most important cognitive outputs available. The quality of genuine relationship, the specific capacity to be fully present with another person, is a production of stillness that the always-on mind cannot access. The creative insight that produces genuinely original work, the moral judgment that requires the full engagement of the prefrontal cortex rather than the reactivity of the amygdala-dominant stress state. The wisdom that comes not from the accumulation of more information, but from the integration, in genuine quiet, of the information already available. All of these require the mind that is willing to rest. Part 5. The practice of genuine stillness. The practice of genuine stillness is not the same as the practice of doing nothing. Doing nothing in the context of chronic stress frequently produces not rest, but the specific anxiety of the activated mind without the distraction that usually mediates it. The experience of lying down and immediately finding the mental processor running faster than it was before. Genuine stillness is active in the specific sense that it requires the deliberate engagement with the conditions that produce the parasympathetic state, not the forced imposition of calm, but the deliberate creation of the physiological and attentional conditions in which calm can genuinely arise. The first practice is the breath, the physiological regulation that the breath provides specifically, the extended exhalation that activates the vagus nerve and shifts the autonomic balance toward parasympathetic dominance, is the most immediately accessible of all the rest practices. Not the breath held or controlled, but the breath extended and released. The specific ratio of a longer out-breath than in-breath, a ratio of approximately 2:1, is the most documented activation of the vagal brake, the parasympathetic mechanism that functions as the nervous system's own deceleration system. 4 counts in, 8 counts out. 2 minutes. The physiological state begins to shift in ways that the will alone cannot produce. The second practice is the body scan, the deliberate, slow, non-judgmental movement of attention through the body, noticing what is present in each region without attempting to change it. This practice does two things simultaneously. It engages the insula and the somatic awareness systems that are associated with genuine rest, and it provides the restless mind with a genuine object of attention that is present moment-anchored rather than future or past-directed. The mind that is genuinely attending to the sensation in the left shoulder is not simultaneously running the tomorrow's worry loop. The attention cannot be fully in two places at once. The third practice is the deliberate engagement with natural environments, what the environmental psychologist Rachel and Stephen Kaplan called restorative environments, spaces that engage what they call involuntary attention, the effortless, not requiring effort kind of noticing that natural environments reliably produce, rather than the directed attention that work demands and that fatigue depletes. The research on the psychological and physiological effects of time in natural environments, reduced cortisol, reduced blood pressure, improved mood, enhanced immune function, is among the most consistently replicated in the field. The access to this practice requires nothing more than the deliberate choice to be in it, with the specific quality of unhurried, non-goal-directed presence that the practice requires. The fourth practice is the scheduling of genuine rest with the same seriousness applied to the scheduling of productive work. Not the vague intention to rest when there is time. There is never time, in the chronically demanded life, that appears unprogrammed and available. The deliberate protection of specific periods of genuine non-productive time, defended with the same firmness applied to the most important professional commitments. Because the rest is a professional commitment to the brain and the body that produce the work, and without whose genuine recovery the work degrades. The mind that will not rest is asking for something specific, not more willpower applied to the demand to slow down. The genuine experience of safety, the physiological experience of a nervous system that does not need to be in high alert right now, that can release its vigilance, that can allow the activation to discharge and the baseline to lower. That experience is not delivered by the intention to rest. It is produced by the specific conditions, the breath, the body, the natural world, the genuine schedule, that signal to the ancient survival system that the alert can stand down. Building those conditions into the structure of daily life is not self-indulgence. It is the maintenance of the most important instrument available to you. And the still mind, genuinely given what it needs, will show you things the always-on mind has never been quiet enough to find.